بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، ونبدأ الآن في موديول 8. هذا الموديول راح يتكلم عن موضوع الفيكتورز بشكل عام. أولاً, a vector is basically a quantity that has a magnitude and a direction. And the resultant vector is a combination of two or more vectors. Let's take the following example to understand how we can write the resultant vector from vectors. Example, you start your journey in Abu Dhabi and travel along the highway to Dubai. 50 kilometers along the way, you stop at a petrol station. Then you travel for 70 more kilometers to reach Dubai. What is your displacement? الآن, if we assume that we are moving in a straight line northeast, we can draw the following schematic. الآن, as we can see here, we have two different vectors. The first vector has the length of 50 kilometers northeast, and the second one has the length of 70 kilometers northeast. If we want to find the resultant vector of these two vectors, then we simply add the 50 with the 70 and we get 120 kilometers northeast. طبعا, we can draw also the resultant vector as follows. This blue arrow represents the resultant vector of A plus B. Now, we should know that there are two types of quantities. The first type is called the scalar quantity and the second type is called the vector quantity. A scalar quantity has a quantity that has only a magnitude. And a vector quantity, it's a quantity that has both a magnitude and a direction. Now we have different examples on scalar quantities and vector quantities. Let's start with the scalar quantities. Length, area, volume, speed, mass, density, temperature, pressure, energy, entropy, work, and power. All of those are examples on scalar quantities. On the other hand, displacement, direction, velocity, acceleration, momentum, force, electric field, magnetic field, and so on. All of these are examples on vector quantities. Now, let's go back to the resultant vector because this is basically the most important part of this section. أولاً, the summation of two or more vectors is called the resultant. A resultant vector can be found by adding or subtracting 2, 3, 4 vectors or more. Remember, vector is represented by a magnitude and a direction. Usually, vectors are denoted by a bold letter, and arrow or arrows are used to represent the magnitude and the direction of it, where the length of the arrow is the magnitude and the arrowhead represents the direction. طبعا, this is the best illustration that can be used to represent vectors. اللي هو الارو، لأن طول الارو يعبر عن القيمة أو الماجنتيود، ورأس الارو اللي هو الهيد يعبر عن الدايركشن. الآن, let's begin with the resultant vector in one dimensions. In this case, let's say we have the resultant vector for A plus B. In that case, let's assume that A is equal to 4 units to the right and B is equal to 8 units to the right. Then the resultant vector R, which is equal to R plus A, is 4 plus 8, and that gives us 12. Since both are in the same direction, we just add and we take the direction of each one of them, which is to the right. But if we want to subtract, when subtracting two vectors, the resultant vector R equals A minus B. In that case, we flip the direction of B. So, for example, if we have 4 units and we have here 6 units, as you can see, the 4 units is to the right and the 6 unit is to the left. Since both are in the opposite direction, and then we have to subtract and we take the sign of the bigger number. يعني بنحكي الآن 6 ناقص 4 بيطلع عندي الجواب 2 وبناخذ الدايركشن الأكبر اللي هو 6. فبيكون عندي direction للريزلتنت لليسار. فبالتالي we write down 2 units to the left. إذا دائما في موضوع السبتراكشن نطرح وناخذ إشارة الأكبر. Let's take few examples on vector addition and subtraction. The first one, 5 kilometers east plus 2 kilometers east. Since both are in the same direction, then to find the resultant vector we simply add 5 plus 2, and that is equal to 7 kilometers east. Let's go to the subtraction. Let's assume that we have vector A, which is 4 kilometers east, and vector B, as you can see, it's minus B. Why? Because it's to the left. And the magnitude of this vector is 6 kilometers, but in the west direction. In that case, how can we find the resultant vector? The resultant vector is equal to 2 kilometers west. Why? We say 6 minus 4, which is equal to 2, and then we take the sign of the bigger magnitude, which is the 6. What is the sign of the vector B? It's to negative or to the left. فبالتالي we say R is equal to 2 kilometer. Either we say negative 2 or 2 kilometers west or 2 kilometers to the left. And finally, if we have two vectors A and B, and as we can see, A is greater than B. فبالتالي we subtract because both are in opposite direction, and we say 7 minus 4, and that is equal to 3. Then this is equal to 3. لكن we take the sign of the bigger vector, which is to the right or east. فبالتالي we say the resultant vector is equal to 3 kilometers east. ننتقل الآن إلى الجزء الأهم اللي هو how to find resultant vectors in 2 dimensions. To find the resultant vector of multiple vectors plotted in a coordinate system graphically, head-to-tail method is used. The head-to-tail method is also known as the triangle method in the case of two different vectors only. Is a graphical way to add vectors and find their resultant. إذن هاي عبارة عن إيش؟ عبارة عن طريقة بالرسم فقط من خلالها إحنا بإمكاننا إيجاد resultant vector. طيب، الآن steps of the head-to-tail method. أولاً we draw the first vector to scale in the direction given. طبعاً في هاي النقطة إحنا لازم نركز على نقطة إنه everything has to be drawn in scale. To scale everything. يعني لازم يكون معنا فرضاً مسطرة. باستخدام هاي المسطرة لازم نرسم كل شيء to scale. Then we draw the second vector. How do we do that? We start from the head or the tip of the first vector. Then we draw the second vector to scale in the direction given in the main question. We will see that in a moment. How can we do that? Then 3, we complete the polygon. طبعا we can have 2, 3, 4 vectors and so on. If we only have 2 vectors, we will form basically a triangle. Like if we have 3 vectors, we will create a polygon. So now we draw a vector from the tail of the first vector to the head of the second vector, and finally we measure the resultant vector. الآن كيف احنا بنرسم دائما resultant vector? The resultant vector starts from the tail of the first vector and it ends at the head of the last vector, or in this case the second vector if we have only 2 vectors. Now let's take the first example to see how we can use the graphical method, which is the head-to-tail method, in order to find the resultant vector of 2 different vectors. In this example, طالب منا find r which is equal to a plus b. لازم نوجد الآن مقدار resultant vector r هو عبارة عن a plus b using graphical method. إذن as we can see here, we have a and we have b. Let's start with a. First of all, we draw a as is in the given direction. Then we move B from its tail to the head of A. يعني الآن راح أنقل هاي ال B from its tail to the head of A. لكن we have to keep the same direction and the same length. فبالتالي شو راح يصير عندي الآن؟ We draw B in that direction as we can see. And finally, we draw the resultant from the tail of the first vector to the head of the last vector. فبالتالي راح نرسم الآن resultant vector R باللون الأحمر. الآن إذا كان معنا مسطرة وقسنا طول الآر بطلع عندنا مقدار resultant vector as a magnitude. طب كيف بنطلع الدايركشن اللي هو الزاوية اللي بتصنعها مع الإكس axis؟ We use a protractor in this case. If we use a protractor, we can find the angle of the resultant vector. طيب. Let's take another example. Here we want to find A plus B. أولاً let's start with A. We draw A as is. Then we move B from its tail to the head of A. إذا ننقل B من الذيل إلى رأس A. فبالتالي راح يصير عندي بهذا الشكل. لازم نتذكر دائما بأنه بنحافظ على نفس الاتجاه. الآن how can we draw the resultant vector? Always we start from the tail of the first vector and we end at the head of the last vector. فبالتالي this is the resultant vector of A plus B. Let's take another example. بحكينا الآن find R which is equal to A minus B using graphical method. الآن as you can see here we have a minus. الماينس شو بتعمل؟ It will flip the direction of B. أيوة، فبالتالي ما هو بتختلف عند الكلام نفس الخطوات، لكن بدل ما تكون عندي البي بهذا الدايركشن راح يصير عندي الهيد مقلوب. it will be reversed. it will become in this direction. طيب أولا we draw A as is, then we flip B and move it to the head of A. راح يصير عندي الشكل كما هو ظاهر عندي على اليمين. إذا بدل ما أرسم بهذا الشكل لا أنا بقلبه لأنه معطيني minus B. فالماينس شو دائما بتعمل بالفيكتور؟ تقلب اتجاه الفيكتور. فبالتالي صار في عندي A و B. الآن how can we draw the resultant vector? We start from the tail of the first vector and we end at the head of the last vector. فبصير عندي هذا هو R. Let's take another example. In this case we have 3 different vectors and we want to use the graphical method, which is the head to tail method, in order to find the resultant vector. As we can see we have vector A, vector B and vector C. أولاً we start with A as in the equation لأنه مكتوب عندي في الإيكويشن أول شيء A. Let's start with A. So we draw A as is. Then as we can see here we have minus B. So this minus will flip the direction of B. فبالتالي بدل ما أرسم ال B بهذا الشكل راح نقلب اتجاه ال B لأنه في عندي إشارة minus. كيف بصير شكل ال B؟ هاي هي شكل ال B. بعد ذلك نكمل بالنسبة ل C. C موجود أمامها إيش؟ positive. فبالتالي we move C as is on the head of vector B. أيوة فبالتالي الآن نرسم الفيكتور C. And finally to draw the resultant vector R we start from the tail of the first vector and we end at the last vector, or we end this vector at the head of the last vector. فبالتالي احنا راح نرسم ال R بهذا الشكل. As we can see we have 3 vectors A, B and C, and we want to find the resultant vector R which is equal to A minus B plus C. أولا نبدأ بال A. We draw A as is. طبعا لأنه بدأنا في ال A فبنرسمها as is. Then we move to B. كونه موجود في عندي في الإيكويشن minus فبالتالي this minus will flip the direction of B. إذن we flip the direction of B and then we move B from its tail to the head of vector A. عشان نحكي أصلا شو بنسميها؟ head to tail method. يكون عندنا ال head of the first vector at the end or the tail of the second vector. فبالتالي we move vector B in that direction. طبعا شو عملنا احنا الآن؟ We flipped the direction of B because we have a minus. And finally we go to C since we have a plus. فبالتالي we keep C as is. We move C from its tail to the head of the vector B. فبالتالي we draw C in this direction. And finally to find the resultant vector we close this polygon and we start from the tail of the first vector and we end at the head of the last vector. And this is vector R which represents the resultant vector of A minus B plus C.